Hi everyone, my name is Joe Yates. I'm the co-director of the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy. It is lovely to have you here today for the webinar. Thanks for joining to take part in this webinar called To Present or Not to Present, Gearing Up for ANH 2020. So we're lucky today to have our colleagues Jamed Falik, who is the Visual Design Team Lead at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Janet Hodar, who's a Communications Specialist from CGIAR Research Program on Agriculture for Nutrition and Health. And they're going to be talking to us about how to effectively communicate our work, providing insights and concrete suggestions on how we can enhance our presentation styles and better communicate research and findings, particularly importantly for virtual events. So thanks to everyone who's joining, who's a presenter for the Academy Week. I know that hopefully you would have got your guidelines last night. Thanks again for being patient with us. We're doing a lot of work to try and transition this event into a digital offering. And if you haven't already signed up for the event, whether you're a speaker or not, then please do now try and do so this week on through our website. You will have to be a member to join the event this year, but it's free, of course. And you can do so after the webinar. The link will be posted here. So just a couple of little notes. We've got another webinar next week, actually, on equitable partnerships in global agriculture and food systems and nutrition research. Sorry for the noise, I'm sitting next to a road. So I hope you can join that one as well. And the links to that will be provided soon or during the webinar as well. So while this session is specifically designed for presenters at ANH 2020, there's still a lot of transferable skills. So I'm hoping that there's people here on the call as well who aren't necessarily speaking, but will see the value in taking part. I'm going to hand over to Janet and Jamed in a minute, but first a few technical announcements about Zoom. I'm sure everyone's been on lots of Zoom calls as we have recently, but I'll just go through them anyway. So first, this is a webinar that will be recorded and posted on our website. So if there's anyone you know who hasn't been able to take part, you can let them know that this is going to be available. Second, you'll notice you've been muted, but please do use the chat function to introduce yourself. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, which organisation perhaps, and whether you've come into the Academy Week before, or if it's your first time. You can access the chat box by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom console. So this webinar is going to begin with a presentation from Jamed and Janet, and then following the presentation, there's going to be a chance for us all to have a conversation and chat about what your reflections on the presentation itself, or if you want to ask any questions about the guidelines you received last night, either for posters or oral presentations, then I'll be able to answer those as well. You can use the chat box throughout the webinar to lodge any questions, and we'll do our best to raise them during the Q&A session. If you've got any technical issues, please just check your audio settings or your internet connections, often one of those two things. And you can also try to reconnect using the link, refreshing the link. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Janet and Jamed. Thanks a lot again, and look forward to the presentations and the Q&A after.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. Nice to see everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you so I can start showing off my slides. So if you give me one moment here, I can do that. All right. Everyone should be able to see this. Great. Okay. All right. So my name is Jamed Falik. It's good to be here. I manage a team of graphic designers and videographers.
Hey, Jamed, sorry to interrupt, sure. But we can see the notes at the side.
Oh, you can? Okay. Haha. What about now?
Amazing.
Does that work?
Good. Yeah, looks
All right,
great.
Awesome.
Thanks.
And then, yeah, sure. No, thank you for that. Could you still see my video?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna turn off my video. Okay, there we go.
Great.
All right, good. Thanks for that. So my name is Jamed Falik. I manage a team of graphic designers and videographers at IFPRI. We offer a lot of different services to the Institute. We work on infographics and conference banners, brochures, flyers, logos, research posters, and of course, today's topic of conversation, presentations, PowerPoints. So I'm going to ask you a question. How many times have you attended a conference and had to suffer through a presentation with slides that are packed with text and super complicated graphics that are in small fonts, and it's very difficult to read? I bet a lot of you have experienced that. I myself have experienced that quite a bit. So today's presentations tend to distract audiences, and the result could be something that I like to call visual vertigo. So this is when you're trying to read a slide while also listening to a presenter at the same time. And typically this presenter is not speaking directly to the slides that they're presenting. So you're caught in this like very awkward moment where you're trying to process two different feeds of information at the same time. It's difficult to do that. What happens usually is those messages are lost on you as an audience member, and as a presenter, you're not able to effectively communicate your research. Well, there is hope. I've worked on literally hundreds of slide decks over the years here at IFPRI, and I've come across a few common pitfalls that could easily be avoided by researchers by simply applying some basic design principles and techniques that I'm going to go over here in today's presentation. Okay, next slide. So don't worry, I'm not going to get into color theory or overcomplicate things with semiotics or typography. So we're not going to focus on that today. Today's presentation that I'm giving is all about effective communication. So these are simple design choices that you can use to help convey your research in clear and concise ways. If your slides are filled with a lot of text and bullet points and equations and complex graphics and all of that, your audience is going to strain to follow you and have incredible difficult time understanding what you're saying. So they're going to tune out. These days, in our own virtual environments, it's easier to tune out as opposed to you sitting in a room. There are hundreds of distractions that you have available to you in front of you on your computer with no one sitting next to you. So if you're in a situation where it's difficult to follow a presentation or there's this visual vertigo that's occurring, you're going to tune out. And as a presenter, that's a lost opportunity. Okay, so a few words here on terminology when it comes to PowerPoint slides. So there's a document slide, and document slides are dense with content. There's a lot of words, a lot of text. I like to call these slide-uments. This is a Word document that's taken and converted into a slide. You have the teleprompter slide, which many of you have seen before. This is when text on the slide functions as a crutch for the presenter. So the audience either reads the slides or listens to the presenter, but you can't do both. And then there's the presentation itself. Now, presentations have slides with a lot of visual aids that reinforce the presenter's message visually in a way that doesn't distract, right, from the message. So remember, this is a key point that I do want for you to take away from today's conversation. PowerPoint is a totally different form of communication than writing. So therefore, it requires a different approach to presenting your research. Okay? You write a paper, you have your article, you can't simply just convert that into a presentation. You have to think differently about communicating your research through the medium of PowerPoint, right? So designing slides that are well structured, that are visually dynamic, are going to help your colleagues, your partners, funders, right, better understand your work. Okay, think like a designer. So design isn't just about making things look pretty, although designers do that. Design at its core is about solving problems in the most convenient, simple, and elegant way. So design focuses on the experience, right, of the message. So making this experience as beautiful and memorable as possible while also communicating information. So to succeed as a presenter using PowerPoint, everyone needs to think as a designer. So every decision you make on your slides is intentional. It's deliberate. Your placement of visual elements, from text to background to color choices to photos to graphics, are all based on logic and meaning. It's intentional. Here are a few examples of slides that are using very poor design choices in relation to fonts and colors and structure. It's all just a mess. It's all very confusing. You know, in this case, there's no continuity here, visual continuity. And what happens is this does not convey to your audience a sense of confidence, right? If you're messy on your slides, then yeah, people can assume your approach to your research is also messy. And that's a message that you don't want to convey. Here's another extreme example of a slide with just entirely too much. Okay, so today there are going to be 3 techniques that I'll cover. Here's what you need to remember. Always look for opportunities to visualize your content. Harness the power of photos, data visualizations to help your audience remember and understand what you're saying. You have to unify all these elements together into a common look and feel through color and text and structured layout. So again, inconsistent design gets in the way of clearly communicating your research. And then focus. So bring your audience's attention into your presentation to ensure that they understand and remember the most important aspects of your research. You know, slides that are free of clutter, that are clearly structured, will help people's attention onto what it really matters. So you want to focus their energy in terms of paying attention to you. So I get a lot of questions right off the bat about fonts and what fonts are good to use here. You know, every font has its own personality. I recommend 3 fonts that are preloaded onto all PowerPoint applications, so you don't have to worry about these not appearing on someone else's computer. So Arial, Gill Sans, or Havelica are the 3 fonts that I recommend. These are universal. Okay, so photos. So let's start with photos, the backbone of every engaging presentation. You know, the photos you use in your presentation should have a purpose. That is to bring life to your research in a way that words can't. Remember though that photo selection has to be deliberate and has to correspond to the information that you're presenting. So with that being said, photos could be used as a background texture in many ways to bring color and interest to your slides. In this case, the slide here, I found a photo that has enough open space over to the right to support text boxes here without making the slide too busy. So you can take a basic slide with a lot of text and you can add a photo to the right here. You could crop this photo in a number of different ways through PowerPoint. You can use preloaded shapes to crop photos, which is always nice. So in this case, it's taking that circle and kind of pulling it out up into the top right-hand side of the screen. And here's an example of using a photo and some transparency on that photo as a title slide. So you can turn the photo into a background. And here are 2 resources that I often use for finding photos online, Visual Hunt and Flickr. Something to remember, always credit a photo. If you noticed in my slides in the bottom right-hand corner, I had a photo credit there. In small font, it doesn't have to be big, but as long as it's there. So icons. Icons are a lot like photos in that you could use them to make your slides more engaging and more memorable. These can help connect and unify different segments of your discussion. So here is an example of a couple of research topics that a presentation will cover. It's very bland, basic. So what you could do is you could restructure this and use icons instead. So this is an alternative approach. Here's another example. So if I go back, this is an overview slide of my presentation today. Pretty basic. Here's an example of taking that same slide and taking that information and structuring it in a way where you're relying on icons as visual elements to your deck. Here's some resources for finding icons. Flat icon and noun project are fantastic. PowerPoint now actually has an icon feature. So in the top nav bar under a insert an icon, they offer some fairly basic, but I would say helpful, a helpful selection of icons that you can use that's already a part of your application, so you don't have to go to third-party websites. So data visualizations, we've all been overwhelmed with trying to decipher like data-heavy slides during a presentation. It's not easy. It requires a ton of concentration, especially when you're trying to listen to a presenter at the same time as you're trying to decipher the complexities of a graph. So here's the thing. When you're reading a report, you are processing information in your own way at your own pace. During a presentation, however, it's much less forgiving in terms of the situation. You're trying to decipher and make sense of a complex graph while someone is talking to you at the same time. And in many instances, sometimes that person is saying something that isn't directly related to the complexity of the graph that you're trying to decipher. So again, you're caught in this very awkward moment of trying to understand something and having the presenter not helping you do that. Oops, go back here. So when it comes to displaying data in your presentation, you have to adhere to one major principle, and that's clarity. It's critical that data visualizations are clear and concise, and that they help you convey key messages about what your data is telling you. So here are a few examples I'm going to take you through. This is a graph, simple, it gets to the point. I've used the entirety of the screen here to let it breathe. This is the same graph, but I've taken the color legend, which you see in small font below, and I pull that out so it's easier to read. So you're not struggling to figure out what those lines are. And then if you've noticed, I've added that highlight box, which is that green box. So this is an example of how you can draw someone's attention and focus into a presentation. So when I'm speaking about yields of selected crops, let's say in this case, I'm focusing on a key time period and what the data is showing me during that time period. So it's a great way to draw someone's attention into your graph. Now here's a slide with a lot of information. It's good technique to deconstruct slides. So you can take out your title. So there's your title. You can pull it out as a standalone slide. You can then pull out each graphic as separate slides and talk through these like so. And so you're going from, if I go back here, you're taking this, which is a lot of information all at once, and you're just deconstructing it and taking up the entirety of your palette, your canvas. Right? Okay, so we're going to move on to another technique here, which is called layering. So let's say you have this chart, which is there's a lot of information here to process. Mainly because the legend is really small. It's crammed down in the bottom of the slide. So first, I'm going to pull that legend out. Boom. So you have the color legend right next to the lines there. So you're letting that legend breathe. And then I'm going to apply a technique, again, called layering, where you're graying out the lines that you're not talking about, and you're focusing on one element of this graphic. In this case, you're talking about tablets. Okay, then you're going to talk about laptops. So again, you're taking something here and you're using a layering technique to draw someone in and enable you to focus on some key messages specific to each of these data points. And you can apply the same technique to process graphics. So this is a process graphic here. It's good to start off sort of at the macro and showing someone what this process entails, but then you can move through this same graphic by pulling out elements of it, right? So, you start off big and then you drill down. So I'm going to talk about capital assets now. You pull back, you say, okay, I just covered capital assets. Now I'm going to talk about the social environment systems dynamics. So you're just drilling down on each of these elements without overwhelming someone. Again, through the layering technique. Here's a good example of a very dense slide with a lot of text. You can apply layering here where you're graying out some of these bullet points, and you're just moving through each of this slide and focusing someone's attention. So a very easy technique, and it really does help your audience focus on what you're saying. As you move through your presentation, I think it's good to give your audience some guideposts as to where you are and when a section ends and another begins. So you can use these transition slides as moments to pause, right, between sections, to take a breath. This allows your audience to also, take a breath and focus again. It sends a signal to everyone that you're moving from one section to the next, and it will help you draw people's focus back into you and what you're presenting. So these are examples of different title slides. All right, I'm going to talk about animations pretty quickly here. It comes up a lot when I'm working with individuals on presentations. Animations are great. PowerPoint has added a lot of new functionality to animations. They're fun to play with, and you could do a lot of really cool stuff. Right? This is just an example of something that I put together to give you a sense of what PowerPoint can actually do. It's impressive. However, beware. Animations are a bit of a rabbit hole. They're fun, but they are incredibly distracting. They take a lot of time and tend to be a bit addictive. So you get caught up in making sure an animation does the exact thing that you want it to do. And what that does is it pulls you away really from focusing on what your key messages are, and making sure that there's visual continuity across each of your slides. And it just, I think it's a bit of a distraction. So I would recommend not to use a lot of animations if you do want to go down that road. But if you do, just keep them very simple and make sure that you practice delivering your presentations so you know where those animations occur. Otherwise, you can get pretty tripped up and confused, and it just ends up being kind of awkward where an animation that you might have put in but then you forget is there moves content in a way that you don't want it to. All right. So the final slide of a presentation, questions, you did it, congratulations, you're done. You see these a lot. They're good to have, but they don't leave your audience with a final concluding statement. So instead of using something like this, what I recommend doing is ending your slide deck on what you want those key messages to be. So you're leaving your audience with a lasting bit of information. So in this case, I was talking about visualization, unification, and focus. So this is a good opportunity for me to say, okay, we've reached the end here, just as, a reminder to circle back here on some of the key takeaways that I want you to leave the room with. Here they are, and you can go through your deck accordingly. So Janet, I'm going to pass this over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to put my video back on, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Janet.
Sure.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or depending on where you are, to you all, and thanks again for being here. My name is Janet Hoder, and as Joe mentioned, I handle communications for the CGIAR research program on agriculture for nutrition and health. I'm here today to talk about what you can do to prepare to deliver a powerful and engaging virtual presentation. So let me go ahead and get my all right. I'm also going to turn off my video. Okay, so like the visual part of your presentation, many of the same principles of a good spoken delivery remain true regardless of whether you're delivering it live or recorded or in person or virtually. But the differences are important to consider. In a virtual environment, your tools for engaging your audience are really limited to basically three. You've got your slides, your voice, and your narrative. There's no gestures, there's no hand movements, no facial expressions or anything like that to drive audience focus like they would be in an in-person presentation. But limited tools don't mean limited chances of success. As Jamed detailed for the visual part of the presentation, you have a lot of vocal and verbal tools available to you. What you do with each of these parts adds up to a lot of impact. I will say, I think a crucial mistake many people make in preparing for a presentation is limiting their focus to the visuals and not preparing the vocal and verbal delivery. In other words, they kind of figure once the slides are done, they're ready to go. However, research into audience engagement has shown that neglecting your vocal and verbal preparation gives up a lot of your potential impact. What they found was 55% of meaning is communicated through what someone sees. So without a question, the slides are important. But you wouldn't go into an exam having only studied like half the material, right? With 38% of your meaning communicated through your voice and the remaining 7% through your words, you have a lot to work with. And what's more, in a virtual environment, this 45% is the difference between somebody flipping through your slides or dropping off the call altogether and really listening to what you have to say. So let's unpack what you can do to harness the rest of this presentation potential, starting with your voice. I'm going to walk through 3 vocal considerations for you today, and the first one is your tone. Whether your presentation involves no video or a small video square, you don't really have gestures or expressions to help focus the audience. They rely on your voice to guide them. So emphasizing a word or changing your inflection can help people stay focused. But when we're talking to a screen, it's really easy to sort of slip into a monotonous delivery. You may notice that this doesn't happen when you're having a conversation with someone, even if it's over the phone. So before your presentation, I would recommend that you pay attention to how you emphasize things in a conversation. I mean, do you change your tone when you're making a point? Or maybe you lower the pitch when you're describing something really intense, or you raise it to express surprise. I'm exaggerating with these, but you get the sense here of how it is that your conversation would differ from a monologue. And paying attention to some of these elements in the conversational environment can help you bring them over to your presentation to help keep people engaged. The second consideration is pacing. I'm not going to talk about the words you choose just yet, but let's consider how many of them you're using. When you've got too much to say, you're going to speak too fast. When you speak too fast, the audience can't process what you're saying. The best analogy I have for this is packing a suitcase. When you go on a trip and you're trying to bring too much, things get smashed or wrinkled and everything is kind of a mess. But when you pack what you need, things stay organized and neat and have the space they need. This is as true for ideas as it is for shirts. So once you've made that space, use it wisely. Get comfortable with the pause. I think that we're uncomfortable with silence and we feel the need to fill every moment of it, but really give yourself a chance during your presentation to have those breaks. There are some really key points at which those can come up. And one of them is, for example, when you're changing slides. As Jamed was saying, people are trying to process what they're seeing along the same times that you're trying to explain something to them. Don't compete. Give them a moment with the visual and then start talking. You can also use the pause to break up ideas in your narrative. And you give people time to digest what you've said when you do this. A third consideration is your energy. Some people like to read their remarks, and I will admit that that's a great way to say exactly what you mean to say, especially in a virtual setting when it's hard for anyone to see that you're doing it. I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm kind of reading a lot of what I'm saying now, but my goal with the way I planned and prepared these things and going through some of these techniques that I've talked about is for you to not know that unless I had said so. There are different ways that people feel comfortable presenting, so I would not necessarily recommend reading. I think that it works for some people. It does not always work for others. It does not work in all situations, and I don't think that it's a good idea to be dependent on it. But you can kind of use it in certain situations virtually more than others. However, a big drawback with it is that it can lead to flat voices. When you've got video, it leads to a lack of eye contact. The other issue is we tend to write longer sentences than we speak. If you're worried about having enough air to get you through your sentence, you cannot focus on your delivery. You cannot focus on your energy, your inflection. You may wind up putting in a pause somewhere that it doesn't make sense so you can grab that breath of air. Really pay attention to how you're structuring your presentation so that you can consider your energy and harness that to connect with your audience. I'm going to take a moment here to make an important note about this. Whether you're reading from notes or not, it's critical, in person or virtual, please don't read the slides. I think that this is the easiest way to make an audience tune out from what you're saying. And I think that that's particularly true in a virtual environment. If people get the sense that basically you're just reading to them what's in front of them, they're not really going to see a point in staying with you, and then you lose the opportunity to tell your story. Okay, so back to energy, just a few quick tips about how you can kind of harness that. First, before you even begin your presentation, take some deep breaths and relax and get the tension out so that the energy you're bringing to it is positive and not nervous. Smile. You heard this before, no doubt, because it's true. People can hear it in your voice. And then consider things like maybe standing up brings a different energy to you. Maybe making small hand gestures, physical changes that you're making that might enable you to kind of generate some physical energy that can translate into some verbal energy. And above all, practice so that you're not so focused on getting the words out that you don't have the space to consider that energy. Okay, so these are considerations for the vocals. While that combined with your visuals makes up 93% of the presentation, I'd argue that it's this last 7%, the words that you're choosing, that make all the difference. They are the foundation everything else will build on. In these words, you're telling your story, and that story is going to drive what you show and how you speak. So the first thing to do when considering what you're going to say is to consider who you're going to be saying it to. Okay, so let's be honest, who among us hasn't made an old presentation work in a different setting instead of fitting the presentation to a new audience? It takes time, and we don't always have the time to make these modifications. But whenever possible, I think we owe it to ourselves and to our audience to consider each situation individually and independently. Identify what it is we're hoping to accomplish and how those we're reaching out to get their information. You're going to talk differently to a group of donors compared to a group of local partners, compared to perhaps a group of peer researchers. And so think about how it is they're getting their information, what it is they need to know and receive it best, and then tailor your presentation accordingly. But of course, how is it that we tailor that narrative? Identifying the elusive message. I would argue that this is the thing I get asked about the most in terms of how to do it. And unfortunately, there is no magic recipe to uncovering your messages. But don't worry. I think that it's actually not as intimidating a process as a lot of people think it is. And to me, truthfully, the best way to get at your messages is to ask yourself and to have others ask you a series of questions to kind of help you zero in. I think the reason that we can't really define a magic recipe to messaging is because it is a pretty individual experience. You need to think through for yourself with regard to your work and your audiences, what's important and what you really want to distill things down to. The first few times you go through this process, it may feel arduous and kind of clunky, but over time, I think you're going to find that you refine it rather than reinvent it. You may be incorporating new research you've done or a new audience you're speaking to, but once you've got the basics, those messages are going to feel easier to speak and kind of shape into different narratives based on the situation. Coming back to our topic of the day, however, let's consider what's different about this in the virtual environment. As JMed was talking about, people need a sharp narrative that they can follow, and it's important to define the story for them. And in order to do that, you have to define it first for yourself. You have to figure out what's the beginning, the middle, and the end. And this is a great time to revisit that suitcase analogy I made before. Make sure that you're putting in what you need and leaving behind what you don't. And while we're talking travel, give your audience a map. You need to tell them where you're headed using cues like, I want to make 3 points, or there were 4 steps in this process, and then use those cues to give them points along the road so that they can follow and keep track of where you are. And finally, it's important to remember that this is not like writing a suspense novel. It's okay to give people a sense of where you're taking them from the beginning. One of the cardinal rules of journalism is don't bury the lead. This means don't wait to share your news until halfway or later in the story. And while you may not want to start with the concrete results, and that makes perfect sense, it's okay to give people an idea of where you're headed, especially in a virtual presentation where it would be very easy for them to walk away and you wouldn't know. The words you choose and how you order them will help you engage with the audience and help them stay connected. This can happen through stories, small anecdotes. You can use descriptive details, emotions, insights. This helps them see you as a person, even if they can't actually see you. And it gives them a chance to switch away from processing the technical information you're sharing and kind of reset. It keeps them, I think, from zoning out. And things like rhetorical questions can help them find themselves in your story, but also give you the chance to sort of draw back on some of those vocal tools, like a change in inflection, that can help recenter their attention if it drifted. Finally, be sure that your narrative explains your slides and vice versa. And this is echoing what JMed was talking about earlier, I think, from the other side. You need to give your audience the tools they need to support what they're seeing, but you need to explain where it fits into the story and share what it means. Don't make them try to process it and listen to you at the same time. The conclusions that they draw may not be what you wanted them to see. Don't leave that piece to chance. So in the process of making sure that your visuals are easy to understand and accessible, make sure that the words that correspond with those and go along with those unify and kind of help draw things together. Okay, so with those considerations, I'm going to leave you with a few tips today, and I'm going to break one of my rules and kind of walk through these in a more read-through format. But I think that they're important, and that's why I'm going to do that. First of all, practice often and all the way through. A lot of times I think we practice the beginning of a presentation over and over, and then the end only gets run through once or twice. That makes it really difficult to get comfortable with the flow of your presentation, to identify where you should be pausing, and to also work out exactly how you're going to explain complex topics clearly. It's also really helpful, and I'm throwing this one in there for Joe, it helps you keep to the time you've been allocated. So if you've been given a certain number of minutes, and you all have for purposes of ANH Academy Week, if you've gone through your entire presentation, before you give it, you'll know if you're way over that time or if you're close to it, and you can make your adjustments accordingly. So practice all the way through. Also important, and this is something I think a lot of people don't think to do, is to warm up. Just like before you go exercise, you have to get your muscles ready for the workout you're about to give them. And some people will do things like pick part of their presentation and read it, or something out of a newspaper, but don't go in cold. You know, like stretch a little bit, like, you know, but also make sure that you're used to speaking, warm up your verbal muscles. And then one that's less intuitive, while you're presenting, talk to someone. And I'm not talking about a real person, because I think it could be very uncomfortable to have a real person in the room with you while you're trying to give a virtual presentation. But take a photo of someone that you enjoy talking to and feel comfortable around, and position it right above or right next to the camera you're speaking to. The audience won't really be able to tell that you're looking at it instead of them if you have a camera on. And if you don't, then it doesn't matter anyway, but it gives you something to connect to. It helps you to remember that you're having a conversation. It helps you direct the energy. It helps remind you to engage rather than just read through things. At this moment, I have a picture of my daughter stationed right above my camera, but I would not be asking her to physically be in the room. We've already talked about smiling. So the last piece of advice I'm going to give you is a simple one. Make sure you have a glass of water close by. They always remember to put these things up on the stage so you don't have to think about it. But at home, you have to do that for yourself. And the last thing you want is to need it and have to get up mid-presentation to go get it. And make it a plain glass or bottle so that you don't accidentally advertise anything on the video feed. Speaking of those visual concerns on video, before we open to questions, I'm going to turn it back to Jamed, and he's going to talk for a few minutes about some considerations about making the most of the physical space that you're in when you're giving a presentation.
Great. Thanks, Janet. Some really good tips there. I like the one with the water bottle. This is my water bottle here. So this is probably not something that, yeah, I need to go with more of an elegant, simple glass instead of advertising a bunch of random stuff. So excellent. I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical setup of your camera and of your physical space as it translates to a virtual environment. So I'm going to share my screen again. Hopefully I can do this successfully this time. And here we go. All right. Excellent. So a few technical tips for live presentations. Something very easy that everyone should do before they participate in an event or log on to a Zoom conference. Just clean your camera. Use a simple microfiber cloth or a tissue. Just make sure that camera lens is nice and clean. There's no dust on it. You'd be surprised at how effective this really is. It's always good also to, if possible, invest in a decent webcam. Most of us are using webcams that are a part of our computers, and those cameras are not good. So you're going to get a grainy, low resolution image. It's difficult these days, unfortunately, to find webcams, but I'm hoping that in the next few weeks or a few months, more will be available. So keep your eyes out for a decent webcam. Lighting is always important. Keep in mind, I don't have a good lighting setup here, in that if you can kind of see off to my shoulder, I have a window directly behind me, and that window is throwing off a lot of light, and my camera is struggling with the white balance. So ideally you would be in a room where a window is either in front of you, so it's throwing light onto your face, or to your right or the left. So that natural lighting is really good to have. Lamps are also nice to have. I have a lamp in front of me here, and if you can kind of see how I've positioned that, I can move that around in order to light my face in different ways. So the lamps are good, but I would say avoid standing in front of a window or a strong source of light. It's going to throw off your camera, and it's going to struggle. You're going to want to position yourself in the middle of your frame. So, be aware of where you are. You're going to want some nice space around you. You know, you don't want too much head space, so, or too little, right, if you're cut off. So this is a good example here of positioning yourself in your in the middle of your frame and allowing that area to breathe around you. And then lastly, try to find a place that's quiet, film indoors if possible. You know, be aware of any sounds that might be occurring in the background that you have control over, like a clock or an air conditioner that's creating a buzz. I'm going to end on a few examples that I've found online that kind of give you a better sense of things to avoid or things to mimic and mirror in your own physical space. You know, bookshelves, everyone's looking at your bookshelf. I have a bookshelf over off my shoulder. This example here in my presentation, the gentleman on the left, you know, that bookshelf is a little cluttered. It's not that organized. You know, you need to clean up your space. This gentleman here on the right, it's colorful, it's organized, it's clean. It doesn't distract. It doesn't get in the way of, you know, of him presenting what he's presenting on. You want to keep things simple and clean if possible. So if you don't have a bookshelf, you're going to want just a plain background. Be cognizant though of what's behind you. You know, the image on the left here, there's just that odd door frame that's kind of protruding out of his head that looks very weird and awkward. You know, the gentleman here, many of you know, on the right, Mark Zuckerberg, just nice and clean, simple background, some white shades, well lit. It's all you need. Framing and angles. So on the left here, the Governor Tom Wolf has way too much headspace. So, you know, Biden has a good amount of headspace above him. It's a nice, clean shot. He's well positioned in the frame. On the right here, this happens all the time. And it's something that you should try to avoid. This is the plate of food point of view, where the camera is below you, so it's not at eye level, and it looks like you're leaning over into the camera like this, and the perspective is a plate of food, right? It looks like you're about to eat the camera or eat the audience. So my recommendation, find some books, find something to elevate your computer so that camera is at eye level with you, and make sure that you're sitting up straight and working on your posture and looking directly into your camera like that. Okay, that's it for me. I'm going to stop sharing and I'll turn this over to Joe.
Thanks, Johnny and Jamid. That was brilliant. I learned a lot myself, actually. Just as you mentioned the glass of water, I looked at mine, it has a brand on it, so I had to put it down quickly as I was drinking it. I'm glad to say I actually happened to have David Bowie looking at me as well, so that's who I talk to.
Very nice.
So we've got some time for questions and answers now, and there's a couple coming in on the chat box, and I've also got a few. So if anyone, just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, then you can put it in the chat box, or you can also put your hand up using the little hand function, and we'll try and bring you in if your mic's working as well. There's one here which is an interesting one, because it's something that I think since Zoom has done so well recently in the lockdown, and their background function has become quite popular. And there's a question from Laura Hackle about, you know, what do you suggest on virtual backgrounds? Is that a good thing to play around with? And if you do, what can you avoid? There we go. Jamid, you're on mute, actually.
Sorry, here's some examples of a virtual background. See, like when I move my head, you see that weirdness that's happening around me. It looks like I'm kind of like cookie cutter. You know, I'm bald, so this is not really working out for me. I look really odd. I'm not going to use a virtual background. We have a number of different options here that are branded. This one's actually isn't too bad. So my recommendation is to play around with it. Ideally, your organization has designed a branded background. You know, you can switch this so it's not, is that even working? It's not working. So I think the point here is play around with the backgrounds. If they're not working or if they're distracting, then I would say it's better to have just a nice clean environment behind you and work on your physical space and not get too caught up with the background. You know, people go to extreme lengths to make those backgrounds really interesting, like with palm trees and oceans. And I would definitely not recommend using any of those.
I think also in a time where you're really trying to connect with people, they feel, I mean, they're obviously artificial. And so I think that by virtue of having one, it takes away a little bit of your opportunity to connect with people. You know, just because it's not even, you know, that you don't have a plain background behind you because you're not necessarily sharing anything about yourself in a plain background, but at least people aren't wondering why are you using a virtual background? What's actually behind you? So I think it can be a distraction and can kind of keep people from being able to really connect.
Right. Okay, thanks. There's a question here from Tanya about switching, any tips you might have for switching between two or more speakers that have pre-recorded videos, you know, which might involve cutting and pasting two videos together. Is there any, have you got any tips on how you might do that? I guess that's about preparing materials, if that's right, if I understand you right, Tanya. Tanya, if you just want to clarify that part. Meanwhile, there's a question here from Anne-Marie Mayer about the 3-slide poster presentation. And this is one I thought might come up. I'm quite glad it did come up, actually. So for those of you who are joining, who haven't come to the Academy Week before, or who aren't, you know, aren't presenting this year, the poster presentations for the Academy Week are have a 1-minute slot where they can present their work. And this year, in the past, we've had 1 minute, 1 slide, and this is in plenary, obviously in the conference when it's happening physically. But this year, we're asking poster presenters to upload a 1-minute presentation, and we're saying that it can be a maximum of 3 slides. Obviously, that increases the, you know, the content, the visual content. But as Anne-Marie said, if you've got any recommendations for, you know, balancing that, you know, temptation is to put a lot of information there because it's only 1 minute. So Janet, have you got any thoughts on that?
I'll take a first cut at it. Let's go back to my analogy about packing your suitcase for a moment. With the 1-minute presentations, I like to refer to that as packing your carry-on. There's really only so much you're going to get in there. So really think carefully about what it is that you absolutely have to have with you. And in those instances, you're not looking to tell people your entire story. You're looking to tell them enough to get them hooked to go learn more. So I think that when we've seen the really successful ones at ANH Academy in the past, it's when people take their time, they really have narrowed down what they want to say to 1 or 2 points, so they're not rushing through it and people are trying to say, wait, you know, I'm looking at the slide and you're speaking a million miles a minute. They've really thought it out and just distilled it down to a few things and have left people with that ask. To learn more, go here. And to me, that's the best advice. You know, it's a perfect example of less is more.
I really like this travel analogy, Janet. I think it's incredibly applicable to presentations. You know, distilling your message down, starting there, and then once you've come to a point where you're comfortable in what that messaging is and what's in your suitcase, at that point, then you can transition over to the design and ensuring that what you're putting on your slides are reinforcing your message and not distracting. So in many ways, it's important to start with that messaging before you ever even open up PowerPoint. PowerPoint could be very distracting. You get caught up in, you know, the colors and the fonts and all these different options, and it's overwhelming, and it distracts in many ways from what should happen in the very beginning is, you know, deciding on what you put in your suitcase first. So that would be my recommendation.
That's really interesting. Thanks. And there's a question that's come in that's got linked to that actually, and it's around are there any tips you have for the number of slides in the presentation? And this is an interesting question because last year we actually for oral presenters we did say that there would be a maximum of 16 slides, but actually for our own learning experience we realized that, I don't know, perhaps the number of slides is a bit arbitrary and it's how you use them. Is that what you'd say, Jared?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's how you use the slides. It's not the number of the slides. You know, people have a tendency to pack their slides with as much information as possible because they want to minimize the number of them. And I would say focus more on what that messaging is and mapping out, as Janet was talking about, kind of mapping out your journey and how you want to bring your audience through your research. And as you map that out, you can work on the sequencing of slides and click through them in a way while you're still meeting your time limit, which is important, and hitting on those key messages as you're speaking. So yeah, let your slides breathe, let them be free. Let those graphics especially be free. So don't be afraid to take, you know, a slide that has like 3 or 4 different graphics on that and then pull it out and deconstruct it while being aware of how you lead someone through your research and your presentation and what that journey is.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, I would echo in on that just really quickly. I think a lot of people will say, oh, I have a limited number of slides, so I'll throw in an animation because then I can basically cheat and have like 4 slides where I, you know, only count as 1. And I think in terms of any conference I've attended or been part of sort of an organizing group for, where people have come and said, you know, I have a few more slides, but I'm not using animation. You know, I have the extra slides because I wanted to avoid that. I've only heard sighs of relief because animations always seem to go wrong, or they don't translate well into, you know, what you're going to be able to contribute and leave with, you know, on the recording or things like that. So, so yeah, I would just echoing Jemed and sort of throwing in that extra little bit.
Thanks, Janet. Actually, this is a question for you as well, probably, Janet. In terms of, I think something that is quite difficult sometimes for our audiences is pitching for our presenters, sorry, pitching to your audience, because sometimes it can be quite diverse in terms of researchers, donors, practitioners, policymakers. And so Deepak's got a question on this about, you know, what do you suggest if there's a mix of audiences from different categories, say press, donor, community? Does it require a mixed approach, or how would you go about framing this?
It's a really good question. I think that there's 2 things to think about. One is still take the time to sort of identify who those audiences are and maybe do a little prioritizing. You know, if there's a handful of donors or policymakers in the room full of peers and researchers, you know, but you've only got these 3 people, but those are the 3 people that if they walked out knowing what you were talking about, it would really make a huge difference. Don't be afraid to kind of tailor some of that to a smaller segment of your audience. That said, if you knew that there was a mixed group going in, I would just kind of make sure that that I was doing it with an eye towards making sure that there was nothing that was going to be so far over anyone's head or things like that, that it made it uncomfortable or really disconnected part of the audience. So you don't want to overgeneralize, but I would think about word choice in those instances, maybe taking a moment to sort of define a couple of key concepts and not assuming that everyone will know what you're talking about, you know, changing up the tone a little bit. It definitely goes on a case-by-case basis based on what the makeup of that is. But yeah, thinking through some of the priorities about who it is you're trying to reach, and then just figuring out the best way to kind of make sure you're not leaving anybody behind.
Wonderful. Thanks. By the way, just to let everyone know, the webinar is, we're happy to continue talking for another 10-15 minutes for anyone who wants to stay. So if there's still questions, we can continue. And there is a question here from Nilofer, and this is a really important topic for us. It's something we've been trying to do a lot of thinking about around the Virtual Academy Week, about connectivity, bandwidth, data for people in places where there might be a bit of a problem. And then Nilofer's question is, in many cities around the world, we do have a situation where the internet connection is unstable and the speaker or presenter has no clue how to handle it, and it can be quite scary being in front of like a sort of faceless audience when your connection is going. Have you guys got any thoughts about how you could handle this situation? I can say one thing quickly, just for those of you who are presenting, who are oral presenters at the Academy Week. We're really interested to know if this is a problem that you come up with against often. We'd like to hear from you, and we're going to look at ways in which we can support, if it's possible. If it's just a case of needing more data to upload things or to have a stable connection, then we're looking into ways that we can do that. But over and above that, if there's a dodgy connection, or if you find that it's a bit intermittent, any thoughts, Janet or Amit?
I think it's always good to close down as many applications on your computer as possible, so nothing else is interfering with your upload speeds. Also, be aware before you jump in online of others in your household that also are using wireless at the same time. We have so many devices in our houses that are constantly connected to our wireless network, or internet connectivity suffers as a result. So you could kind of sweep through your house and make sure those devices are off and shut down, and that you're the only computer that's uploading that signal through Zoom. I've found that to be very helpful.
I think also, this is definitely a good time to be identifying what your plan B is, and sometimes your plan C and your plan D. Have a conversation with the organizer or the moderator if you're concerned that that's going to happen, and figure out how you would handle it in the moment. And sometimes it's a matter of making the moderator aware, so that if the connection goes down and you need a moment to reconnect, they can kind of, sort of guide people through that pause. Sometimes, if you've got a backup technological solution where maybe you can join by audio, but somebody else can upload your video or your slides and go through them for you, then, have a plan for, something like that. Just think about what alternatives you might be able to do ahead of time, and kind of make sure that those concerns are brought to light, so that people can kind of help you think through what your alternate solutions could be.
Thanks, guys. So there's a question, Tanya. I think Sylvia, could you possibly unmute Tanya so we can hear from her question about the multiple speakers?
Hi. So I'm asking with regards to something like the learning labs that are coming up, where you might have had two speakers who were going to be speaking, kind of taking it in turns to speak in a presentation. And if you want to try and put that together in a pre-recorded way, and you're in two different continents, so you have one person recording their part of it, and then it'll switch to the other person, but you don't want the participants to be having to click on multiple different videos to open that. You want to put it together. I'm just kind of thinking, okay, there's the software element of how do you actually do that, but also in terms of that moving between one speaker and the other, do you recommend we put up a picture of the person so the audience can kind of see who's coming in now, or that kind of transitioning? Any suggestions for that?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, adding a photograph of someone as a transitional aspect to the video. The software, there are a number of free applications that you can use online for editing video that are fairly straightforward. Learning curves aren't that bad, where you can take those two separate files and put them into one.
That sounds good, thanks. And Tanya, for anyone who's on here who's leading a learning lab, any issues you feel like you're coming across, do let us know, and we'll try and see if there's been solutions that other people have arrived at elsewhere, and we can share those with all Learning Lab facilitators. There's an interesting question here from Clement about language, and this is obviously a real big challenge as well. And how can the issue of language be harmonized in the sense that, for instance, the issue of pronunciation can be misleading to audiences. Is there any tips on that? Obviously, the audiences for the Academy Week in particular are very international. So any thoughts?
I think that this is sort of underscores why thinking through your word choices ahead of time and thinking about that verbal component is really important, because it gives you a chance to plan out what you're going to say and kind of, in particular, look for things that that might be phrases that are not widely known. I find myself throwing out things randomly. I think I just did it a few minutes ago, thinking to myself, like, oh, when you're talking a mile a minute, is that something that people are going to readily be able to kind of process? So looking out for those different phrases and eliminating them, or finding more common ways to express some of those things ahead of time can be helpful. But I think that there's a certain element of that, especially operating in sort of more international environments like we all do, that people have kind of come to expect and kind of become more comfortable in doing, is just sort of adding that layer of processing when someone's talking, so that accents, it may slow you down a little bit in terms of being able to absorb what someone's saying, but it doesn't necessarily become an insurmountable barrier. So I would more look for the phrases that might not resonate across broad audiences, and worry a little bit less, I think, about pronunciations or things like that.
Wonderful. I think we've got time just for one or two more questions, and one that's come up a couple of times is about templates for slides, presentations for the Academy Week. So we haven't actually issued prescriptive templates, partly because we want you to have the freedom to, use your own creativity according to the kind of work you're presenting. But in the guidance notes, you'll find that there is a request to put the ANH Academy logo and hashtag and any social media handles you might have at the start of your presentation. If you're having any issues with your presentation, you can reach us, and we're really happy to help you with any technical issues. So do get in touch. There's a suggestion that's coming from Myra, actually, in relation to Tanya, your query, that that could be that person A calls person B in Zoom. So there's two participants in that call. Then you present to each other and record the presentation with the recording option in Zoom. And in this way, you'd have one video of the whole presentation, which is an interesting workaround. So that's great, actually. Yeah. So that's we might use that ourselves. Thanks. So I've got one last. I think there's one last question that's coming through. Let's have a quick look. Yeah, there was one jam on your whole thinking like a designer approach. And what do you think about PowerPoint templates that are preloaded? Have you got any thoughts on those? Because I noticed that yours are all kind of customized.
Right. So these are templates that you would purchase online?
No, the ones that are sort of held in the software itself.
Oh, in the software. PowerPoint has come a long way with those templates, and some of them are quite nice visually. They look great. So yeah, go for it. If you can find something that works for you, that isn't too distracting, then I would say check those out, and again, try to customize them as much as possible. With branding from your institution, or in this case, ANH, it sounds like we'll have their own template. So you just want to make sure you're using the templates provided by the organizer. But if there is an opportunity for you to create something on your own, then I would say, yeah, explore that feature. I think PowerPoint has come a long way in the past couple of years around their ability and functionality with providing some good design options that are already preloaded into the software. So definitely take advantage of those.
That's great. Well, I think we've come just about to the end of our time. So I want to say big thanks, Jamed, and to Janet for all your expertise in this. It's really, it's great to learn so much, actually. I think there's always space for learning more in presentations. And thanks to Abel and Dashur and to Sylvia Levy as well for organising us in the background, and to Megan Dini and Heike Rolke for organising all the questions as well to make it easier to moderate. So I hope that's been useful for everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing many of you at the Academy Week. And if you haven't yet signed up, please consider doing so at on our website. And any questions or queries, do get in touch. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.